I have the privilege of sitting with Miss Donna Harrow, who I have known personally for about, I venture
Be
to say,
careful.
yeah, 8 years, I would say roughly. And I met Donna initially when I was interested in the Afrocentric School and doing a documentary on it. And in spite of perhaps a history of experiences with people who look like me, Donna was kind enough to judge me on the merit of who I was and what my intention was. And subsequent to that, I came and volunteered at the center, and I've been fortunate to develop a relationship with you and call you a friend, whether you accept that label or not. So it's within that spirit that I'm taking this course on education. And there was an article, Don't Believe the Hype, and I just thought it would really be a privilege for the students of the class to gain the feedback and insight from someone who's a stakeholder in the field for the past, let's say, 30 years on many different levels. So what I want to try and hope to bring to the classroom is this idea of not projecting our understanding based on other people's lens, but to actually introduce a lens that has the first-hand experience. So Donna, as I mentioned, founded the Afrocentric School in Toronto, which was a revolutionary shift in the education system. And Donna, if you'd be so kind, briefly, if you could just give a little bit more of an introduction in terms of your extensive background of over 30 years in the field.
Sure. So I I got my little 25-year apple from the Toronto District School Board, which means that I worked with the Toronto District School Board for more than 25 years. So I started working as an educational assistant and then moved on to a school community worker within the school, which meant that and I also worked as an African heritage teacher. So I not only worked with students, but I worked with parents and I worked with community as a community worker. And that meant it gave me an opportunity to see the school from not only the inside lens, but from the outside lens, and to try and liaise the community and the school together. So that has been my experience with the TDSB, and I've done that at the school level, but I've also done that at the level of the executive offices when and the trustees when we put the Afrocentric school together.
I just want to say before we get into my first question, how thankful the class, my peers are, the professor is, that you have made the time. And I'd also like to note that Samantha from Toronto Community Housing is kind enough to film and edit this for us. So if I may, Ms. Dawn, I'd like to start with the first question related to this article that we both reviewed by Ferguson, Don't Believe the Hype. And Ferguson brings into focus this issue of school labeling as this kind of hidden curriculum. I'm wondering if you could speak on that.
So, not only in the United States, not only in provinces where we think are backwards, right here in Toronto, in Ontario, in Peel, in the Toronto District School Board, in the Catholic School Board, we experience the same kinds of labeling that happens in this school, in this article. It's important to note that schools and school staff take that schools are in a system that is archaic in their boundaries, in their parameters. Their rules, their policies and procedures go way back, and it hasn't changed. So the racism that kept students out of school 100 years ago, black students out of certain schools 100 years ago, or 20 odd years ago when this article was done, it's important to understand that this very same thing is happening in 2017. And so the labels continue, even though we try to be equitable and we say that we're equitable out loud. However, the hidden policies, the hidden rules are exactly the same. So the labeling of students mightn't keep them out of school, but they keep them out of certain opportunities. And they place them in situations like special education classroom, special needs classroom. They place them in situations where they are away from the normal kids. And the normal kids are usually the white kids, maybe white middle class kids, because sometimes poor white kids get dumped in with the black kids here in Toronto.
Thank you. As one of the founders of the Afrocentric School in Toronto, how do you see it disrupting some of these racial practices and racialized practices within the education sector?
So, one of the main reasons for having the Afrocentric School was to take the Eurocentric lens off of things, not to turn things into a black school, but to understand and honor that within our society, African Canadians have made contributions in history and contributions in other parts of our society and our community that we need to recognize and honor. It wasn't being done in the regular school system. Our students, I remember the video that you did, and I remember the little girl who said she held her hand up until it was tired, and then she put it down. She felt as if she was invisible because she wasn't recognized. There are many, many students throughout the system who feel that way. And so the reason for the Afrocentric School was to make sure that other lenses were being included in the education of students.
Going off script for a moment, but following up on that question, personally speaking, as the filmmaker who made the documentary, what I found quite alarming, I'd like to get your feedback on this, and it's going to be somewhat politically incorrect, is when I was interviewing people, what I realized, especially when it came to white people, is they were far more offended at the prospect of an Afrocentric school than they were at the prospect of black youth dying in the street. And that just really left an impression with me, because I didn't see the same type of passion, same type of focus on the idea, or any kind of regard actually for dead bodies in the street, but the idea that an alternative school that followed the curriculum of the that they're supposed to, rather, but from an Afrocentric perspective, was so offensive, but dead bodies in the street weren't, to put it very politically incorrect. I'm wondering if I may get your thoughts on that observation.
I think when we look at all of this, we're living in a society where people are still following the rules and the ideas of way back when. And so it is politically correct for us to hide our racism. And most of us do, right? We hide our racism. And we look at Donald Trump, who says, the people the voices that have been ignored can now speak. And you can see that the people who are speaking up are people who want to say the awful things about black people. And I'm looking at what's happened in Canada so far. The placards that were posted up
Near
and
York
so on.
as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we need to understand that people will be upset about black children sort of rising, getting the opportunity to rise and succeed. So people will say, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, because black children are given the opportunity. If they're taken out of a place where they're invisible and they're put in a place where they can thrive and be successful, the hidden racists will be upset about that. They're not upset about black young men killing each other. They're not. So what's there for them to say? They're not going to fight about that, those hidden racists, right? And so our systems are still based on that, because the funding and so on that go to organizations that work in the community, they go to mainstream white organizations. And the smaller organizations that do frontline work with those young men who shoot each other in the head don't get the funding from the City of Toronto. So that's another thing that I'm sort of working on now, because it's all about equity, right?
Thank you. Going back to this article for a moment, this concept of the unsalvageable student was brought up when discussing these programs that are available for at-risk youth, and the kind of process behind the decision of whether to accept the students that will quote-unquote benefit versus the unsalvageable students. And I'm very curious about your response to the idea of the unsalvageable student.
So, in order for the special ed classes and so on to thrive, we need those students. And those students, you must have low expectations for those students. When you read on in this article, you see a young man who becomes the author's assistant. Brilliant young man who could assist her at the university level to choose her questions, to make sure that she posed her questions well. And this was one of the young men chosen for this program because he was one of the unsalvageables, right? And so the lens again that you look at is this child can't make it. And he can't make it because, he gets in trouble and he might come from a certain socioeconomic background and so on. And he doesn't pay attention the way he should in class. And so he's not going to make it to the level that we want. So he's going to go in this group of unsalvageable kids. On the other hand, you could look at this child as a brilliant child who's bored with the material that he has in front of him in his classroom, who is told to sit at a certain spot and sit at a certain spot for a long period of time with no opportunity to do anything else. Um, and so that child gets into trouble. So it's all in the way we look at it. And it's all in the way we make or break a child. And I think as classroom teachers, people have to understand that they make or break a child. And I think some do understand that, and it's deliberate that they choose to put certain children in the spaces that they do.
What's funny, I don't want to get too far off track with my next question, but what you just said was one of the issues that was spoken about earlier in this course, which was the idea of projection, and how the students are using the teachers, pardon me, are using their childhood, the sense of nostalgia and memory, to project onto the students they're teaching, which raises to me a very uncomfortable question. What if they didn't interact with black students, or what if the black students they interacted with led them to create a certain stereotype that they're now projecting within the context of teaching? But that's another
and I think one thing I want to say about that is how do we fix the system so that that doesn't happen? Because when the classroom teacher closes the door, we don't know what's happening inside of those classrooms, right? And so it's always at that teacher's discretion. It's always with that teacher's experience that those children will be learning or not learning. And so we need to be able to fix the system so that when we know that there might be a bias, that we don't turn a blind eye to that teacher's bias, that we really do something about it if we want this system to be equitable.
And the bias is so profound that in the beginning of the article, it starts with this kind of discussion between two teachers, and even an African American teacher himself is assigning those labels to the young man, which speaks to how embedded it is within the culture, and how independent of race, you're still have those images just driven into you to where you see the results of that. Now, we were talking about the expectation of failure, and that raises a question of systemic racism. And when I read the article, one of the aspects that I think brings this into focus is when the author mentions that no one was surprised by the makeup of the program, that African American youth and boys in particular were predominant, the vast majority of the students, where that seemed to be normalized, that black students would need those programs or be a participant in those programs. So, and you spoke about Peel and so forth, and I'm wondering about that expectation of failure. If they're not surprised that specific students are constantly in this program, then to me, there'd be almost an expectation of failure for these set of children. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so remember that hidden curriculum.
Yes.
When we look at young black boys, there's a syndrome with grade 4 black boys. At around grade 4, they're usually bigger than the rest of the kids in the class. And they become a bit intimidating to teachers. And so that's sort of when the shift starts to take place, because that's when the confrontation starts. That's when the no, I'm not going to do that attitude starts from students. And that sort of gets them veered into a certain area, right? And so it's almost natural it's almost natural in a way that we get a lot of young black boys in those kinds of classes, because teachers start to ignore them. Teachers start to send them to the office more. They are missing their classrooms when they're excluded from class. They're missing their lessons. And so it's hard for them to catch up. And so they need the tutoring and they need the extra programs. And they become behavioral problems. And so they're put into behavioral classrooms. So it's all sort of a chain reaction, you know, based on these young men and how teachers view them.
And again, looking at the article, I want to ask you about one of kind of the central questions raised, but I have to apologize for the question itself because to me, it inherits a lot of assumptions just in the way that the question was written, but I'm almost taking verbatim from the author. And the question is, because it assumes, like I said, you'll understand, but I'm literally saying it verbatim, and I'm wondering if you could address kind of that issue is, why is the majority of children getting into trouble and frequently in the office are African American, not in the world, not in all of Canada or North America, within the context of this article? Again, the way the question was posed, I thought inherited a lot of assumptions, but aside from that, what would your response be to the question, which I'm taking from the actual reading?
So I mean, the fact is, it's happening, right? I mean, if you look at first the number of kids who are being suspended and so on, it goes that way. If you look at the number of African Canadians, and I'm going to switch it back to Canada, if we look at the number of African Canadian males that are in prison versus the number of African Canadians, you see that the percentage is really high, right? So it's there, and I believe that it happens because of, again, the hidden racism that happens, the oppression that young men especially have to go through, and I think it also has to do with a kind of underclass that our society wants to build. And I say that because if we did not want to build that underclass, we would have fixed some of or all of the inequities that have been happening. You can't get change by making the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? So, and this is what's been happening. Even though we have issues and we make errors and so on, we continue to do the same thing. And so it's inevitable that this is going to happen until we fix the inequities that we have in our system. It's kind of weird, but a few days ago, we were hearing on the news about the police going into a Mississauga school and handcuffing a 6-year-old. And you think, what the hell? This is Canada, the place that we love. And this is a little girl that they said was handcuffed because they were scared that she was hurting herself. So she was banging her head and she was spitting and she was kicking. And so they handcuffed her ankles and they handcuffed her arms. And you think there is nothing else that we could do, first of all, within the school system. This little girl, I don't think is a pretty big girl that, we couldn't handle. We can do anything within the system. So we call 911 and the police come in and not only traumatize that 6-year-old, but traumatizes the rest of her class that something like this happens. How do we explain, how do we accept something like that happens in 2016?
Because of where it's happening? Would it be accepted at Forest Hill if that happened? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so. And so when people look at, the Regent Parks of the world versus the Richmond Hills of the world, we know that things are different, rules are different, responses are different. And should it be? I don't think so. The only reason that it is because we've got a larger percentage of a certain kind of people that live in Regent Park and a certain kind of people that live in Richmond Hill.
The ones that live in Richmond Hill inherit a degree of social capital and
Absolutely.
currency.
Absolutely.
If I may, Miss Donna, I'm going to wrap it up with the last question. Before I do, I have to thank you so much. I recognize how busy you are in general, how busy this week is. Also, Samantha, who's holding the camera, because I'm technically inept, has been holding it for 25 minutes from Toronto Community Housing. Thank our classroom. Thanks you as well. Really appreciate both of your time. So what I'd like to do respectfully is leave you with the last word. In terms of the article or any thoughts on the subject in general, I'd like to make sure that anything I left out or anything you want to focus on, you have the opportunity.
So I'm just hoping that classrooms like yours, that conversations like this one can eventually lead to a change in the system. I go to a conference in the States, a conference of a national conference of Black educators. It's called the NAPSI conference, and they've started including now, which is kind of nice, the community in the conversation. But the idea is that we break down the walls with these conversations, and that we not only have conversations, but we find ways of challenging the system so that the powers to be can change those policies and procedures. So it's not only okay to advocate for a mom and her son who is not being treated fairly in the system. It's not enough to do that. We have to look at the policies that make teachers and make principals and make custodians in the school treat certain kids in a certain way. We have to break some of those walls down. So we've been talking for years and years and years and years, but it's time that we do something about it. And when we got to the Afrocentric school, and there was this big kerfuffle about, having young people nurtured in a certain way so that they could excel, people were just going nutsy cuckoo about that. However, when we look at those students now, and when we see them speak in public, those students who would never have gotten the chance and who go off and speak publicly and are so amazing when we look at the marks of those students because people cared about them and how they excelled. It proves that if we change the system to be more equitable, it will make things better and make things better for all students, right?
Is the evidence, last point, is the evidence not in the Afrocentric school and the results where the students are on par or above other students in the same age group? Doesn't that show that these outdated stereotypes, assumptions that are rooted in kind of a racist ideology don't really hold water when the circumstances are equal?
They absolutely don't. But one of the things that we then have to be careful about is that those teachers in the Afrocentric school don't become complacent and don't go back to old norms. That we make sure that this example can be taken to any school in Canada and that all students can benefit from a situation like that where all students are acknowledged, all students are nurtured towards success, and not have certain students as the schoolboys and certain kids as the, and I can't remember what the others were called, the troublemakers.
Yes, yes.
And that we fairly look at the young people that we have in front of us and not be colorblind. Understand